The morning Clara Whitlock left Philadelphia, the sky was the color of old bruises, gray and purple, swollen with the promise of rain that never came. She stood on the platform with one battered leather suitcase and a carpet bag that held everything she owned. 3 dresses, a tintype of her mother, a ivory-handled brush with half its bristles missing, and 16 letters tied with blue ribbon. 16 letters from Thomas Mercer. Each one had arrived like clockwork over 8 months, the handwriting slanted and confident, the words careful and kind. He wrote about Montana Territory, about endless grasslands and mountains that scraped the belly of heaven, about building something real with his own 2 hands. He wrote about loneliness, too, the kind that settled in a man's bones when he had land but no one to share it with. "I don't need a perfect woman," he'd written in the 5th letter. "I need an honest one, someone who isn't afraid of hard work or hard winters, someone who can see past what is and imagine what could be." Clara had read that line so many times the paper had worn soft as cloth. She wasn't running toward Thomas Mercer exactly. She was running from Philadelphia, from the boarding house where she'd scrubbed floors for 2 years, from Mrs. Halloran's pinched face and accusations of theft Clara never committed, from the city that had chewed up her parents and spit out their daughter with nothing but debt and a spine that refused to break. The letters had been a doorway. She'd stepped through. Now, 37 hours into a train journey that smelled like coal smoke and unwashed bodies, Clara pressed her forehead against the window and watched America unspool. The cities thinned, the trees grew sparse, the land opened up like something wounded, raw and endless. A woman across the aisle kept staring. She was older, dressed in black bombazine, her mouth a thin line of disapproval. "Mail-order bride?" the woman finally said. Clara's jaw tightened. "I prefer correspondence engagement." "Call it what you want, girl. Doesn't change what it is." The woman sniffed. "My daughter did the same thing. Thought some rancher in Colorado would save her from spinsterhood. Turned out he had 3 other women lined up. She came home with nothing but shame. I'm sorry for your daughter." "Are you?" The woman leaned forward. "Or are you just sorry you might end up the same way?" Clara didn't answer. She turned back to the window, her reflection ghostly against the darkening plains, and tried not to think about the fact that she'd sent Thomas her last $20 for the train ticket, that she'd burned every bridge in Philadelphia, that if this went wrong, there was nowhere to go back to. The train rattled on. By the time they reached Montana Territory, Clara's excitement had curdled into something harder to name. She'd imagined Thomas waiting on the platform, tall, maybe, with kind eyes and work-rough hands. She'd imagined him smiling, saying her name like it mattered. Instead, the station was chaos. Stockton Bluff wasn't a town so much as an argument between buildings. False-fronted shops leaned against each other like drunks, their paint peeling, their signs hand-lettered and crooked. The street was a river of mud and manure. Men stood in clusters, spitting tobacco and watching the train with the bored hostility of people who'd seen too many strangers come through. Clara stepped onto the platform, her heart hammering. The air smelled like livestock and burning sage. Somewhere, a dog barked itself hoarse. She scanned the crowd. No one stepped forward. "Miss Whitlock?" She turned. A young man with a patchy beard and a shit-eating grin stood a few feet away. He wasn't alone. 3 others flanked him, all cut from the same cloth, dirty hats, dirtier smiles, the kind of men who looked at women like they were livestock. "I'm Clara Whitlock," she said carefully. "I'm looking for Thomas Mercer." The young man's grin widened. "That's me." Her stomach dropped. This wasn't right. The man in the letters had written about philosophy, about the poetry of open spaces. This boy, because that's what he was, barely 20, looked like he'd never read anything longer than a wanted poster. "You're Thomas?" "In the flesh." He swept off his hat in a mocking bow. "Welcome to Stockton Bluff, sweetheart." Something was wrong. Clara felt it in her bones, in the way the other men were watching, in the way people on the platform had started to notice. "Your letters? Oh, those?" Thomas laughed. It wasn't a kind sound. "Yeah, those were real pretty, weren't they? My buddy Dutch wrote 'em. He's got a way with words." One of the men, Dutch, presumably, stepped forward. He was older, sharper, with eyes like broken glass. "Told you I could make her come running. Easiest $20 I ever made." The words didn't land at first. Claire's mind was still trying to rearrange the pieces, to make them fit into something that made sense. $20? She repeated. Thomas clapped Dutch on the shoulder. We had a bet going. I said no woman would be stupid enough to travel 2,000 miles for a stranger. Dutch said they would if you wrote the letters right. And hell, here you are. The platform had gone quiet. Clara could feel eyes on her from every direction. Passengers still on the train, men from the town, a woman in a calico dress standing frozen by the telegraph office. They were all watching, all waiting. You're saying... Clara's voice cracked. She hated herself for it. This was a joke? Not a joke. Thomas's grin never wavered. A bet. There's a difference. Laughter rippled through his friends. Someone in the crowd whistled, low and cruel. Clara's face went hot. Her hands shook. The suitcase slipped from her grip and hit the platform with a thud that might as well have been a gunshot. She'd spent her last dollar getting here. She'd burned her bridges, sold her mother's wedding ring, walked away from the only life she knew. And it had all been for this, for the entertainment of bored men with nothing better to do than destroy someone for sport. You bastard, she whispered. Thomas heard her, his grin twisted into something uglier. What was that? I said you're a bastard. The crowd sucked in a collective breath. Dutch's hand moved toward his belt. But Thomas just laughed again, louder this time. You hear that, boys? She's got fire. He turned back to Clara. Tell you what, sweetheart. Since you came all this way, I'll do you a favor. There's a saloon down the street. I'm sure they could use another girl. You're pretty enough, even if you are dumber than a box of rocks. The world tilted. Clara's vision blurred at the edges. She wanted to scream, to hit him, to do something that would hurt him the way she was hurting. But her body wouldn't move. She just stood there, rooted to the platform like a tree waiting to be cut down. Then someone else spoke. That's enough. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade through butter. The crowd shifted. A man stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 40, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the mountains. He wasn't dressed fancy. Work shirt, worn denim, a hat that had seen better days. But there was something in the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, that made people step back. Thomas's grin faltered. This ain't your business, Vance. You made it my business when you decided to humiliate a woman in public. The man, Vance, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Walk away. Or what? Vance didn't answer. He just looked at Thomas, and whatever he saw in that look made the younger man's bravado crack like thin ice. Come on, Dutch muttered, grabbing Thomas's arm. Let's get a drink. Thomas hesitated, his pride warring with his common sense. Finally, he spat in the dirt near Clara's feet, close enough to make his point, far enough to avoid real confrontation, and turned away. The crowd began to disperse, the show over. Clara stood alone on the platform, her suitcase at her feet, her entire world reduced to ash. Vance picked up her suitcase. You got somewhere to go? Clara's throat was too tight to answer. She shook her head. Figured. He tilted his head toward the street. Come on. I don't... Her voice cracked again. She hated it, hated him for witnessing this. I don't need charity. Good. I'm not offering any. He started walking. I'm offering a roof and a meal. What you do after that is your business. Clara didn't move. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to preserve what little dignity she had left. But dignity didn't keep you fed, didn't keep you alive. She picked up her carpet bag and followed. Vance's ranch sat 3 miles outside town, a stubborn collection of buildings clinging to the edge of a valley. The house was small, 2 rooms, maybe 3, but solid, built to last. A barn leaned nearby, its door hanging crooked on leather hinges. Chickens scratched in the dirt. A black dog with one torn ear watched them approach, tail wagging slow and uncertain. Vance led her inside without ceremony. The main room was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a stove that looked older than Clara. Everything was clean, though, no dust, no clutter. The kind of clean that came from a man who lived alone and didn't know what else to do with his time. You can sleep there. He nodded toward a narrow bed in the corner. I'll take the barn. I'm not taking your bed. Wasn't asking. He set her suitcase down. There's beans on the stove. Help yourself. Clara stared at him. Why are you doing this? Vance paused, his hand on the doorframe. For the first time, she saw something flicker across his face, something old and tired. "Because someone did it for me once," he said quietly, "and I didn't say thank you enough." He left before she could respond. Clara stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the belongings of a stranger, and felt the first crack in the dam she'd built around herself. Her knees buckled. She sank onto the bed, her hands pressed over her mouth, and let the tears come. She cried for the future she'd imagined, for the letters that had been lies, for the version of herself that had believed in them. She cried until her throat burned and her eyes swelled shut, until there was nothing left but hollow exhaustion. When she finally stopped, the room was dark. The beans on the stove had gone cold. Outside, she could hear the dog barking and the low murmur of Vance's voice as he settled the animals for the night. Clara stood. She washed her face in the basin by the window, the water shockingly cold. Then she ladled beans into a tin bowl and ate standing up, each bite tasteless and necessary. Tomorrow, she'd figure out what came next. Tonight, she just needed to survive. The first 3 days passed in a fog. Clara woke before dawn, startled by the silence. No city noise, no clatter of carriages, no voices bleeding through thin walls. Just wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Vance was always up first. She'd find him in the barn or mending fence posts, his movements efficient and unhurried. He didn't talk much, didn't ask questions, just left food on the table and went about his work. On the fourth day, Clara couldn't stand it anymore. She found him replacing a rotted board on the porch, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat darkening the fabric between his shoulder blades. "I need to work," she said. He didn't look up. "You don't owe me anything." "I'm not talking about debt. I'm talking about going insane." She crossed her arms. "I've spent 4 days staring at your walls. If I don't do something useful, I'm going to walk into the mountains and scream until my lungs give out." That got a reaction. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "You know how to cook? I can learn." "Garden?" Same answer. He straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "Chickens need feeding. Eggs need collecting. Vegetable patch is more weeds than vegetables right now. House could use a proper cleaning." "I can do that." "Pays room and board. Nothing more." Clara met his eyes. "That's more than I have now." He nodded once, and that was that. She started that afternoon. The chicken coop was a disaster. Droppings everywhere, nests half-built. One hen so aggressive Clara had to wrap her arm in burlap just to get near the eggs. The vegetable patch was worse. Whatever had been planted there had long since surrendered to thistle and bindweed. Clara pulled weeds until her hands blistered. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Every weed she yanked felt like pulling Thomas Mercer's smug face out of the earth. Every callus that formed was proof she was still here, still standing. By the time the sun set, her back screamed and her fingers bled, but the patch was clear. She stood there, breathing hard, and felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. Vance found her there, dirt-streaked and trembling with exhaustion. "You overdid it," he said. "Probably." "Come on, I'll show you how to wrap those hands before they get infected." Inside, he boiled water and tore strips from an old shirt with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned her cuts, his touch careful and impersonal. "You don't have to prove anything," he said quietly. "Yes, I do." Clara's voice was raw. "To myself, if nobody else." He didn't argue, just finished bandaging her hands and set a plate of cornbread and bacon in front of her. They ate in silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The dog scratched at the door, and Vance let him in. A rare concession. The animal immediately went to Clara, resting his chin on her knee with a sigh that sounded almost human. "What's his name?" Clara asked. "Dog?" "You just call him Dog?" "He answers to it." Clara scratched behind the animal's ears, and for the first time since stepping off that train, she almost smiled. News traveled fast in a small town. By the end of the week, everyone in Stockton Bluff knew Clara Whitlock's story, or a version of it. The mail-order bride who'd been humiliated. The charity case staying with Elias Vance. The first time Clara went into town, she felt their eyes like brands. Women pulled their children closer. Men smirked and whispered. The shopkeeper's wife served her with tight-lipped silence, counting change twice like Clara might try to cheat her. Thomas Mercer was there, leaning against the mercantile with his friends. When he saw Clara, his grin returned. "How's ranch life treating you, sweetheart? Vance keeping you warm at night?" Clara's face burned. She kept walking. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he called after her. "Or maybe you finally figured out you ain't worth the trouble." She made it 2 blocks before the tears came. She ducked into an alley, pressing her back against the rough wood, and bit down on her fist to keep from making a sound. A shadow fell across her. Clara looked up, ready to tell whoever it was to go to hell. But it wasn't Thomas. It was a woman. Older, maybe 50, with iron gray hair and a face that had seen hard years but hadn't surrendered to them. "Don't let that boy see you cry," the woman said. "It's what he wants." Clara wiped her eyes roughly. "I'm fine." "You're not, but you will be." The woman offered a handkerchief. "I'm Ruth Calloway. I run the boarding house on 2nd Street. Clara Whitlock." "I know who you are. Whole town does." Ruth's expression softened. "For what it's worth, Thomas Mercer is a coward and a fool. Always has been. His daddy was the same way before him." "That doesn't help me much." "No. But knowing you're not the first woman he's hurt might." Ruth tucked the handkerchief back into her sleeve. "He pulled the same trick 2 years ago. Girl from Kansas. She went back home, but the shame followed her. Last I heard, she'd married some brute just to have a roof over her head." Clara's stomach turned. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" "Same reason they didn't stop him with you. People like watching other people suffer. Makes them feel better about their own miserable lives." Ruth paused. "But you're still here. That counts for something." "I didn't have a choice." "We always have a choice. You chose not to quit." Ruth's eyes were sharp, assessing. "Elias Vance doesn't take in strays. The fact that he took you in means he saw something worth saving. Don't prove him wrong." Before Clara could respond, Ruth was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she'd never been there at all. Clara stood in that alley for a long time, turning the woman's words over in her mind. Then she straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt, and walked back into the street. Thomas was still there, still grinning. This time, Clara looked him dead in the eye as she passed. Didn't smile, didn't flinch, just looked at him like he was something she'd scraped off her shoe. His grin faltered. It was a small victory, but it was hers. The weeks blurred together. Clara fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, feed the chickens, weed the garden, cook, clean, mend, repeat. Her hands grew strong. Her back stopped aching. The blisters hardened into calluses. Vance was a quiet presence, always working, rarely speaking. But Clara began to notice things. The way he always left the best cuts of meat for her. The way he fixed the broken latch on the chicken coop without being asked. The way he watched the horizon every evening, like he was waiting for something that never came. One night, after a particularly brutal day of clearing rocks from a new field, Clara worked up the nerve to ask, "Why do you live out here alone?" Vance was sitting by the fire, oiling a saddle. He didn't look up. "You ask a lot of questions. You never answer any of them." That almost smile again. "Fair point." He set the saddle aside, his hands stilling. For a moment, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Had a wife once, Sarah. She died bringing our daughter into the world. Daughter lived 3 days." The words were flat, factual, like he was reporting the weather. But Clara heard the weight beneath them. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago." "Doesn't make it hurt less." Vance looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something in his eyes she recognized. The same hollowness she'd felt on that train platform. The same exhaustion that came from surviving when you weren't sure you wanted to. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't." They sat in silence after that, not uncomfortable, just two people who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. Well, spring turned to summer. The garden exploded with life. Tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs Clara couldn't name. She learned to preserve food, to churn butter, to shoot a rifle well enough to scare off the coyotes that circled the chicken coop at night. The town slowly, grudgingly, began to accept her. Ruth Calloway hired her to help with laundry once a week. The blacksmith's wife taught her to make soap. Even the shopkeeper stopped counting her change twice. But Thomas Mercer remained a shadow. He'd show up at the ranch sometimes, drunk and belligerent, shouting accusations Clara couldn't quite make out. Vance would meet him at the property line, rifle in hand, and Thomas would leave, but the threats lingered. "He's going to hurt someone," Clara said one night. "Probably," Vance agreed. "And you're just going to wait until he does?" "I'm going to wait until he gives me a reason to do more than wait." Clara wanted to argue, but she'd learned enough about the frontier to know that justice here was a different animal than it had been in Philadelphia. You didn't call the law. You became it. Still, the waiting gnawed at her. Then, one morning in late July, Thomas forced the issue. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horses. 3 riders, moving fast. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her stomach drop. Thomas. Dutch. And a third man she didn't recognize, older, hard-faced, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Vance appeared from the barn, moving to intercept them before they reached the house. Clara couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Thomas gesturing wildly, saw the marshal's expression harden, saw Vance's hands curl into fists. Then Vance turned and walked toward her. "Clara," he said quietly, "go inside." "What's happening?" "Just go inside." She didn't move. Vance's jaw tightened. "He's claiming I kidnapped you, says I'm holding you here against your will." The words took a moment to land. When they did, rage flooded through Clara so hot and sudden she actually swayed. "That's insane." "Doesn't matter. Marshall has to investigate." Vance's voice was carefully controlled. "I need you to tell him the truth." The marshal dismounted and approached, his eyes sweeping over Clara with clinical detachment. "Miss Whitlock? I'm Marshal Greer. These men have filed a complaint. I need to ask you some questions." Clara's mind raced. This was a trap. Thomas was trying to force her out, to punish Vance for protecting her. If she said the wrong thing, "I'm here by choice," she said clearly. "Mr. Mercer claims you came here under false pretenses, that you were deceived." "I was. By him." Clara pointed at Thomas. "He and his friends made a bet. They lured me here as a joke. Mr. Vance offered me work and shelter when I had nowhere else to go. I'm staying because I choose to." Marshal Greer's expression didn't change. "You're not being coerced?" "The only person who's tried to coerce me is standing behind you." Thomas's face went red. "She's lying. Vance probably threatened her." "I'm not lying." Clara's voice cut like glass. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." The marshal studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Thomas. "Sounds like the lady's made herself clear. You boys got any actual evidence of a crime?" Dutch shifted uncomfortably. Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. "That's what I thought." Marshal Greer swung back into his saddle. "Miss Whitlock, if you ever need help, my office is in town. Mr. Vance, keep your nose clean." He rode off without another word. Dutch followed. Thomas stayed, his horse dancing sideways, his eyes burning with humiliation and rage. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah," Vance replied. "It is." Thomas spat and wheeled his horse around, galloping away in a cloud of dust. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard in the dirt, her whole body shaking. Vance crouched beside her. "You all right?" "I don't know." She laughed, a brittle sound. "I think I just made an enemy for life." "You had one already." Vance's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Difference is, now he knows you're not afraid to fight back." Clara looked up at him, saw respect in his eyes. Maybe something more. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not running me off when I became a problem." Vance shook his head. "You've never been a problem, Clara. Just a person trying to survive. Nothing wrong with that." He stood and offered his hand. Clara took it, letting him pull her to her feet. The garden stretched before them, green and alive despite the harsh soil. Proof that even in the hardest ground, things could grow if you worked hard enough. Clara brushed the dust from her skirt and went back to her weeding. Behind her, she heard Vance say something under his breath. She almost asked him to repeat it, but then she caught the words soft and surprised. "Damn, you're tougher than I thought." Clara smiled to herself and kept working. The confrontation with the marshal changed something. Not overnight, and not cleanly, but Clara felt it. A shift in how people looked at her when she came to town. The pity was still there, but underneath it now ran something else. Curiosity, maybe. or grudging respect. Ruth Calloway noticed it too. "You stood up to Thomas Mercer in front of a lawman," she said one afternoon while they were folding sheets in the boarding house. "That takes guts. Most women would have folded." Clara snapped a pillowcase straight. "I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice. You could have lied, told the marshal what Thomas wanted to hear just to avoid trouble." Ruth's hand stilled on the fabric. "You didn't. That means something. It means I'm stubborn." "Stubborn keeps you alive out here." Ruth smiled, a rare softening of her usually stern face. "My husband used to say the frontier doesn't care about your past, only whether you can make it to tomorrow." Clara had heard Ruth mention her husband once or twice, always in past tense, never with details. She didn't pry. Everyone out here had ghosts. The work at the boarding house was brutal, hauling water, scrubbing floors, changing linens for men who tracked in half the prairie on their boots. But it paid, and more importantly, it got Clara into town regularly. She started to learn the rhythms of Stockton Bluff, the unspoken rules that governed who spoke to whom and why. The town was divided, she realized, not by geography, but by allegiance. There were the decent folks, ranchers, shopkeepers, families trying to build something lasting. And then there were the others, drifters, gamblers, men like Thomas Mercer, who saw the frontier as a place where rules didn't apply. Thomas had friends, too many of them. Clara saw them sometimes, loitering outside the saloon or the livery, watching her with eyes that made her skin crawl. Dutch Morrison was the worst. He had a way of looking at women that felt like a violation, like he was peeling back layers you didn't want exposed. She'd mentioned it to Vance one evening while they were sitting on the porch, the day's heat finally breaking into something tolerable. "Dutch Morrison's been watching me." Vance's jaw tightened, but he didn't look up from the harness he was mending. "I know." "You know?" "Hard not to. Man's not subtle." He set down his tools. "You want me to have a word with him?" "No." Clara surprised herself with the firmness of her own voice. "I just want you to know, in case something happens." "Nothing's going to happen. You don't know that." Vance finally looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. "If Dutch Morrison lays a hand on you, I'll kill him. He knows that. So yeah, I do know." The certainty in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it was oddly comforting. Not because she wanted violence, but because someone was finally willing to stand between her and the world's cruelty without asking for anything in return. "I don't want you getting into trouble because of me," Clara said quietly. "Too late. You're already trouble." But there was no heat in it, almost a fondness. Good kind, though. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just went back to mending the shirt in her lap, her needle pulling thread through worn fabric, making something whole again. The dog, Vance still refused to give him a proper name, sprawled at her feet, his breathing deep and even. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The sound used to terrify her. Now it was just part of the landscape, as familiar as the creak of the porch boards or the smell of sage after rain. The summer heat intensified. The garden produced more than 2 people could eat, so Clara started preserving everything. Canning tomatoes, drying beans, making jam from the wild strawberries that grew along the creek. Her hands were never clean anymore, always stained with berry juice or dirt or lye from the soap making. She was hauling water from the well one afternoon, her shoulders aching from the repetitive motion, when a wagon pulled up the drive. Clara straightened, shading her eyes. A woman sat at the reins, young, maybe Clara's age, with blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid and a baby balanced on her hip. "Afternoon," the woman called. "You must be Clara Whitlock." Clara set down the bucket. "I am. I'm Ann Cordell. My husband and I have the spread about 5 miles west." She climbed down from the wagon with the easy grace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Heard you've been helping Ruth Calloway. Thought I'd come introduce myself." The baby on her hip, a girl, maybe 8 months old, stared at Clara with huge blue eyes and a fist jammed in her mouth. "That's kind of you," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Kind nothing. I'm being nosy." Anne grinned. "Small town. We don't get many new people, especially not ones with stories like yours." Clara's defenses went up. "I'm sure the story you heard isn't accurate." "Probably not. That's why I came. Figure I'd get the truth straight from you." Anne shifted the baby to her other hip. "Also, I brought pie. Apple?" Fresh this morning? It was impossible to stay guarded against someone offering pie. Clara found herself smiling despite herself. Come inside. I'll put coffee on. They sat at Vance's small table, the baby, Lily, Anne called her, gnawing on a wooden spoon while the adults talked. Anne was refreshingly blunt, asking questions most people would have danced around. So Thomas Mercer really did trick you into coming all the way from Philadelphia? He did. What a bastard. Anne took a sip of coffee. His father was the same way, mean drunk. Beat Thomas's mother until she finally took off one night. No one's seen her since. Clara absorbed this. It didn't excuse Thomas, but it explained some things. Violence bred violence. Cruelty learned young became cruelty practiced later. Does everyone know about it? Clara asked. About what happened to me. Everyone knows everything here. It's the curse of small towns. Anne broke off a piece of pie with her fork. But here's the thing. Half the people think you're a fool for coming out here on a stranger's word. The other half think you're brave for staying after it all went to hell. Which half are you? The second one. Anne's expression turned serious. I came out here as a mail-order bride too, 3 years ago. My husband, James, he's a good man, but we had a rough start. I thought I was marrying a prosperous rancher. Turned out he was one bad winter away from losing everything. She laughed, but there was an edge to it. First year, I cried myself to sleep most nights. Thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. What changed? I did. Stopped waiting for life to be what I'd imagined and started dealing with what it actually was. Anne reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. You're doing the same thing. That's worth something. The baby started fussing, and Anne stood, bouncing her gently. I should get back before this one decides she's hungry and wakes up half the county with her screaming. But I'll come by again if that's all right. I'd like that. After Anne left, Clara stood in the doorway and watched the wagon disappear down the rutted track. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt something close to friendship taking root. Not the careful, transactional relationships she'd had in Philadelphia, people who'd help you if it didn't cost them anything, but something real, something that might last. Vance came in from the barn as the sun was setting, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face showing the kind of tiredness that came from honest work. Woman came by, Clara said. Anne Cordell. Brought pie. Good people, the Cordells. Vance washed his hands in the basin, the water turning brown. James helped me rebuild the barn after the fire. Didn't ask for anything in return. There was a fire? 5 years back, lost most of the livestock, nearly lost the house. He dried his hands on a rag. Sometimes I think this land's got it in for me. But you're still here. Don't know anywhere else to go. He glanced at the pie sitting on the counter. She tell you her story? Some of it. Vance nodded, understanding what hadn't been said. Out here, everybody's running from something or towards something, sometimes both. Which one are you? He considered this for a long moment, his eyes distant. Used to be running from. Now I think I'm just standing still, seeing what happens next. Clara cut 2 slices of pie and handed him one. They ate standing up, the way they usually did, comfortable in the silence that had grown between them over the weeks. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was something deeper, built on shared work and unspoken understanding. But that peace wouldn't last. 3 days later, Clara was in town picking up supplies when she saw Dutch Morrison leaning against the post office. He straightened when he saw her, a slow smile spreading across his face like oil on water. Miss Whitlock, looking lovely as always. Clara ignored him and kept walking, her basket of goods clutched tight against her side. Hey, I'm talking to you. He fell into step beside her. That's rude, you know. Ignoring a man when he's being polite. You're not being polite, you're being a nuisance. Clara didn't slow down. Nuisance? Dutch laughed, the sound grating. That hurts my feelings. Good. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to stop her in her tracks. Clara's heart kicked into a gallop, her breath catching in her throat. Let go of me. I just want to talk. And I don't want to talk to you. Clara tried to pull free, but his grip tightened. People were starting to notice, slowing their steps, watching but not intervening. Just like on the train platform. Just like always. See, that's the problem with you Eastern girls. You think you're better than everyone else. Dutch's smile had gone cold, his eyes flat. But you're not. You're just another whore who came west looking for a man to take care of her. The slap happened before Clara's brain caught up with her hand. The crack echoed down the street, sharp as a gunshot, and Dutch's head snapped to the side. Her palm stung, the impact radiating up her arm. For a second, nobody moved. The street seemed to hold its breath. Dutch's face went from shock to rage so fast it was like watching a match strike. "You bitch? Problem here?" The voice came from behind Dutch. He turned, and Clara saw the town's deputy, a lean man named Cal Winters, standing with his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He didn't look particularly concerned, but there was steel underneath the lazy posture. "No problem," Dutch said tightly, his hand dropping from Clara's arm. "Just a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding usually doesn't involve putting hands on a woman." Winters looked at Clara. "You all right, Miss Whitlock?" "I'm fine." "You sure?" Clara met his eyes and saw genuine concern there, not the performative kind. "I'm sure." Winters nodded, then turned back to Dutch. "Get out of here, and if I see you bothering her again, we're going to have more than a conversation." Dutch's jaw worked like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow. Finally, he spat in the dirt near Clara's feet, close enough to make his point, far enough to avoid direct confrontation, and walked away, his shoulders tight with suppressed violence. Clara's hands were shaking so hard she had to clutch her shopping basket to hide it. Her knees felt weak, her stomach churning. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me. Thank whatever bit of sense kept you from doing more than slap him." Winters tipped his hat. "Dutch is trouble. Stay clear of him if you can." "I'm trying." "I know, but trying might not be enough." He looked troubled, his eyes scanning the street like he expected more problems to materialize. Thomas Mercer and his crew. They're getting bolder. Had 2 complaints this week about them harassing travelers on the North Road. Can't prove it was them, but everyone knows. "Why don't you arrest them?" "On what charge? Being assholes isn't illegal." Winters sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "Look, just watch yourself, and tell Vance to do the same." Clara nodded and hurried to finish her shopping, but the encounter left her rattled. She kept looking over her shoulder the whole ride back to the ranch, half expecting to see Dutch or Thomas following her. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made her jump. When she told Vance what had happened, his reaction was quiet and dangerous. He set down the cup he'd been holding with deliberate care, like he was afraid of what he might do if he moved too fast. "He touched you." "Barely, and I handled it." "I don't care if you handled it." Vance stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound. "He put his hands on you. That's not something I'm going to let slide." "What are you going to do, ride into town and shoot him?" "If I have to." "Elias." Clara used his first name deliberately, something she almost never did. It stopped him, made him look at her fully. "I'm asking you not to. Please. It'll just make things worse." "Worse than him thinking he can grab you whenever he feels like it?" "Yes. Because if you go after Dutch, Thomas will use it as an excuse to come after you, after us." Clara's voice cracked despite her best effort to keep it steady. "I can't. I won't be the reason you get hurt." Vance stared at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded in his expression. The walls he kept up, the careful distance he maintained, for just a second, it all fell away, and Clara saw the grief underneath, the loneliness, the fear of losing someone else. Then he sat back down heavily, his shoulders sagging. "All right. I won't go looking for trouble, but if it comes here, I'm not turning the other cheek." "I wouldn't expect you to." The tension in the room didn't ease, but it shifted into something more manageable. They finished supper in near silence, both lost in thoughts too heavy to voice. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind test the shutters. She thought about Dutch's hand on her arm, about the cold calculation in his eyes, about the fact that hitting him had felt good, too good, like opening a door she'd been trying to keep locked. She'd spent her whole life being good, being proper, following rules that were supposed to protect her. And where had it gotten her? Humiliated on a train platform, dependent on the charity of a stranger, living in constant fear of men who saw her as prey. Maybe it was time to stop being good. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it settled over her like armor, cold and necessary. The next few weeks passed without major incident, but the peace felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Clara caught herself looking over her shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds. Vance noticed, though he didn't say anything. He just stayed closer to the house when she was working outside, always within earshot. The garden started to wind down as summer waned, but there was still work to be done. Pulling the spent plants, preparing the soil for winter, preserving the last of the harvest. Claire's hands were constantly busy, and she preferred it that way. Idle hands meant idle thoughts, and her thoughts had nowhere good to go. Anne Cordell visited twice more, bringing her baby and an endless supply of gossip. Through her, Clara learned that Thomas had gotten into a fight at the saloon and been thrown out, that Dutch had been seen with a black eye and a split lip, though no one knew where he'd gotten it, that the ranchers were getting nervous about rustlers hitting spreads to the south. "James thinks there's going to be trouble," Anne said one afternoon while they shelled peas on Vance's porch. Lily was asleep in a basket at their feet, her tiny fists curled near her face. "Says the territory's getting too lawless, too many people taking what isn't theirs." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that ends with someone getting shot." Anne's usual cheerfulness had dimmed, worry lines creasing her forehead. "He's talking about organizing the ranchers, forming some kind of committee to deal with it." "You mean a vigilante group?" "I mean protection. The law can't be everywhere, and Cal Winters is just one man." Anne paused, her hands stilling on the peas. "You ever shot a gun, Clara?" "Vance taught me. Rifle, mostly, for coyotes." "Good. Learn the pistol, too. Something you can carry." Anne's eyes were serious, all trace of her usual levity gone. "I'm not trying to scare you, but you should know how to protect yourself, especially living out here with just Vance." Clara wanted to argue that she was safe, that Vance would protect her, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd learned the hard way that safety was an illusion, and relying on someone else to provide it was how you ended up stranded on a train platform with nowhere to go. "I'll ask him to teach me," she said finally. Anne nodded approval. "Good girl. And Clara, keep that temper of yours in check. Slapping Dutch Morrison took guts, but it also made you a bigger target." "I know. Do you?" Anne leaned forward. "Men like that, they don't forget being humiliated, especially not by a woman. You embarrassed him in public. He's going to want to even the score." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Clara didn't want to examine too closely. After Anne left, Clara found Vance in the barn repairing tack. The smell of leather and horse was strong, almost comforting. She stood in the doorway, gathering courage. "I want to learn to shoot a pistol." Vance looked up, studied her face with those careful eyes. "Any particular reason?" "Because if someone comes after me again, I don't want to depend on you being close enough to stop them." He set down the bridle he'd been working on, wiping his hands on his pants. "All right, we'll start tomorrow." The lessons began the next morning, early enough that the dew still silvered the grass. Vance produced a Colt revolver, older model, well-maintained, and walked her through the mechanics. Loading, aiming, breathing, squeeze, not pull the trigger. "It's going to kick harder than the rifle," he warned, demonstrating the proper grip. "And it's less accurate. You're not going to hit anything past 20 feet unless you practice." Clara's first shot went wide, the recoil nearly knocking the gun from her hand. The noise was enormous, echoing off the barn and startling the chickens into panicked squawking. The second wasn't much better. By the 10th, her arms ached and her ears rang despite the cotton Vance had given her to stuff in them. "You're thinking too much," Vance said, standing behind her, adjusting her stance with careful, impersonal touches. "Point and shoot. Don't aim, just point." "That doesn't make sense." "Doesn't have to. Close quarters, you won't have time to line up a perfect shot. You need to trust your instincts." He moved her elbow slightly. "Try it." She did. The bottle she'd been aiming at exploded in a spray of glass and whiskey dregs. "See?" Vance almost smiled. "Sometimes thinking gets in the way." They practiced every morning for a week. Clara's aim improved, her confidence grew. The gun began to feel less like a foreign object and more like an extension of her arm. Vance showed her how to quick draw, how to shoot from cover, how to reload without looking down. Skills she hoped she'd never need but practiced anyway, because hope wasn't a strategy. One morning, after she'd shattered 3 targets in a row, Vance handed her the gun belt. "It's yours. Keep it on you when you're out of the house." Clara buckled it on, feeling the unfamiliar weight settle against her hip. The leather was old but well cared for, the holster worn smooth from use. This feels wrong. Wrong how? Like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not. You're not pretending, you're preparing. Vance's expression was hard to read, shadows moving behind his eyes. There's a difference. Clara touched the gun's handle, the grip worn smooth from someone else's hand. Whose was this? My wife's. The words hung between them like smoke. Clara started to unbuckle the belt, her fingers fumbling. I can't. Yes, you can. Sarah would have wanted someone to use it. She was the best shot I ever knew. Vance's voice softened in a way Clara had never heard before. She'd have liked you, I think. You've got the same stubborn streak, same refusal to quit even when quitting would be easier. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that would acknowledge the weight of what he'd just given her, but the words wouldn't come. Thank you, she finally managed. He nodded and walked back toward the barn, leaving her standing there with a dead woman's gun strapped to her waist and a growing sense that nothing about her life would ever be simple again. August bled into September. The heat broke, replaced by crisp mornings that smelled like dying grass and wood smoke. The aspens on the far hillside started turning gold, their leaves trembling in the wind like coins. Clara helped Vance prepare for winter, smoking meat, chopping wood, checking the barn roof for leaks. The work was endless and exhausting and strangely satisfying. She was stronger now. Her body had changed, muscles where there had been softness, calluses instead of smooth skin. She could swing an axe without losing her breath, could haul a full water bucket in each hand without stopping to rest. The mirror showed a stranger, sun-darkened and harder-eyed than the woman who'd stepped off that train. Sometimes Clara missed her old self, the one who'd believed in love letters and happy endings. But mostly, she didn't. That woman had been naive, breakable. This one wasn't. She was in town one afternoon, picking up nails at the hardware store, when she overheard two men talking near the feed sacks. Heard Mercer's planning something, big. What kind of something? Don't know. But Dutch was in the saloon last night, drunk, running his mouth about teaching someone a lesson. Had money too, more than usual. Who's the target? Didn't say, but he kept looking toward the door like he was waiting for someone. Clara's blood went cold. She paid for the nails and left quickly, her mind racing through possibilities. None of them good. She found Vance at the livery talking to James Cordell. Both men looked grim, their voices low and urgent. We need to talk, Clara said. They moved to a quieter corner, away from prying ears. Clara repeated what she'd heard. James swore under his breath. That matches what I've been hearing. Thomas has been recruiting, offering money to anyone willing to ride with him. Ride where? Clara demanded. Here, probably. Vance's jaw was tight, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. He wants payback for the humiliation. I'm the obvious target. We should go to the law. And tell them what? That we overheard some drunk talk? James shook his head. Cal Winters is a good man, but he can't arrest someone for running his mouth. He needs evidence, something concrete. So we just wait for them to attack? No. Vance's eyes were cold, the kind of cold that came from making hard decisions. We prepare. James, can you get word to the other ranchers? Anyone who's had trouble with Thomas or his crew? Already done. We're meeting tomorrow night at my place. James looked at Clara, something like pity in his expression. You should come. Anne would appreciate the company, and you've got as much stake in this as anyone. Clara nodded, though her stomach was churning. This was escalating into something she didn't know how to control. The violence she'd been trying to avoid was circling closer, inevitable as winter. The meeting at the Cordell Ranch was tense. 15 men and 3 women, including Clara, Anne, and Ruth Calloway, crowded into the small house. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and anger, voices overlapping in argument. A rancher named Hoskins spoke first, his face red with fury. Thomas Mercer and his gang have been stealing cattle, harassing travelers, and generally making life hell for anyone who crosses them. The law ain't doing enough. It's time we took matters into our own hands. You're talking about a vigilante justice, Ruth said sharply. That's a dangerous road. Once you start down it, there's no turning back. So is doing nothing, Hoskins shot back. My neighbor lost 20 head last month. Can't prove it was Mercer, but we all know it was. Insurance won't cover it because there's no evidence. Man's about to lose his ranch. Another voice piped up. My daughter was harassed on the road to town. 3 men, masked, but one of them was wearing Dutch Morrison spurs. I'd know those Mexican rowels anywhere. The argument went back and forth, tempers flaring, accusations flying. Clara listened, her hands clenched in her lap. She thought about Thomas's smug face on the train platform, about Dutch's hand on her arm, about the casual cruelty of men who thought women were things to be used and discarded. Finally, she couldn't stay silent. Thomas Mercer isn't just a thief. He's a coward who gets his power from humiliating people weaker than him. Her voice cut through the chatter like a knife through cloth. He won't stop because we ask nicely. He'll stop when someone makes him. The room went quiet. A few men nodded. Others looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Vance spoke up, his voice calm but firm. We're not forming a lynch mob, but we are going to make it clear that this community protects its own. Anyone seen riding with Mercer's crew gets turned away from our businesses, our land. We make them pariahs. And if they retaliate, someone asked, then we defend ourselves. Together. A woman Clara didn't know raised her hand. What about our families? If we take a stand, they'll come after us, after our children. They're already coming after us, James said. Question is whether we face them divided or united. The discussion continued for another hour, voices rising and falling like waves. Finally, they reached a consensus of sorts, a mutual protection agreement. Any ranch under threat would send up a signal fire. The others would come armed and ready. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something. The meeting broke up near midnight. Clara and Vance rode home in silence, the stars cold and distant overhead. The temperature had dropped, and Clara pulled her shawl tighter. You think it'll work? Clara finally asked. I think it'll force them to make a choice, either back down or escalate. And if they escalate? Vance's hands tightened on the reins, his knuckles white in the moonlight. Then people are going to get hurt, maybe killed. Clara thought about the gun on her hip, about Anne's warning, about the look in Dutch Morrison's eyes when he'd grabbed her arm, about the fact that she'd learned to shoot not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. I'm not going to run, she said quietly. Whatever happens, I'm staying. Vance glanced at her, and even in the darkness she could see something shift in his expression. I know. How do you know? Because running isn't who you are, not anymore. The words settled over her like a benediction. Clara looked out at the dark prairie, at the land that had nearly broken her and then forged her into something stronger, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly. Something harder, determination maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to let bastards win. She wasn't the woman who'd stepped off that train. That woman was gone, burned away by shame and hard work and the slow accumulation of small survivals. This woman, the one riding through the night with a gun on her hip and dirt under her nails, this woman was someone even Clara didn't fully recognize yet, but she was beginning to like her. The week that followed was strange, suspended between normalcy and disaster. Clara went about her daily work, feeding chickens, tending what remained of the garden, helping Ruth with the boarding house laundry. But everything felt different now, charged with anticipation, like the air before a thunderstorm. Vance was different too, more watchful. He kept his rifle close, even when working in the barn. At night, Clara would wake to find him standing at the window, silhouetted against the stars, watching the road. You should sleep, she said one night, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Someone needs to keep watch. We can take turns. He looked at her. You need your rest. So do you. We're in this together, remember? After a long moment, he nodded. They worked out a schedule, Clara taking the first half of the night, Vance the second. It was exhausting, but it was fair. On her watch, Clara sat by the window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, listening to the night sounds. Coyotes. Wind. Once the distant sound of gunfire, too far away to matter. She found herself thinking about Philadelphia, about the life she'd left behind. It felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else. She wondered sometimes what would have happened if Thomas's letters had been real. If she'd stepped off that train to find a kind man waiting, a future built on honesty instead of cruelty. Would she have been happy? Or would she have discovered, eventually, that the frontier demanded more than kindness? That survival here required a hardness she'd never needed in the city? Maybe Thomas Mercer, bastard that he was, had done her a favor. Thrown her into the fire hot enough that she'd had to become steel or burn up completely. She was contemplating this bitter thought when Dog started growling. Low and continuous, his hackles raised. Clara set down her coffee and reached for the rifle. "What is it, boy?" The dog's eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the barn. Clara strained to see, but the moonless night revealed nothing. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, moving slowly, like riders trying not to be heard. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood, moving away from the window, and called softly toward the bedroom. "Elias, we've got company." He was up instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the other window. "How many?" "Can't tell. Dog heard them first." They waited. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere near the property line. Clara could hear voices now, low and indistinct. "Could be travelers," Vance said, but he didn't sound convinced. "At 2 a.m? "No." They stood in the darkness, weapons ready, every sense straining. Minutes crawled by. Then, without warning, the riders moved on. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "What was that?" "Scouting, maybe. Seeing if we're awake, if we're ready." Vance lowered his rifle but didn't set it down. "They'll be back." "When?" "Soon." Clara wanted to ask how he knew, but the answer was obvious. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Whatever had happened to him before he came to Montana, before his wife and daughter died, it had taught him to read violence the way other men read weather. Neither of them slept the rest of that night. They sat together in the main room, weapons across their laps, waiting for dawn. When it finally came, pale and cold, Clara felt hollowed out with exhaustion, but she also felt something else. Ready. Whatever was coming, she wouldn't face it cowering. She'd face it armed and standing. They came 4 days later, just after noon, when the sun was high and shadows were short. Clara was in the garden pulling the last of the squash vines when Dog started barking. Not his usual warning bark, but something deeper, more urgent. She straightened, wiping dirt from her hands, and saw the dust cloud rising on the eastern road. Riders, at least 6 of them, moving fast. "Elias!" Her voice came out sharper than she intended. He was already moving from the barn, rifle in hand. "Get in the house." "No." "Clara." "No." She pulled the Colt from its holster, her hand steadier than she expected. "I'm not hiding." Vance looked at her for a long second, and something passed between them. An understanding, maybe, or just the acknowledgement that this moment had been coming since the day she stepped off that train. "Stay behind me," he said finally, "and don't shoot unless I tell you to." They positioned themselves in front of the house, the porch at their backs providing cover if things went bad. Dog stood between them, still barking, his teeth bared. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Thomas Mercer sat his horse in the center, grinning like this was all some grand entertainment. Dutch Morrison flanked him on the left, and Clara didn't recognize the other 4, hard-faced men with the look of hired guns, the kind who do anything for the right price. But it was the 7th rider that made Clara's stomach drop. A man in a marshal's coat, though not Cal Winters. This one was older, with a silver badge that caught the sunlight and cold eyes that had seen too much and cared too little. "Elias Vance," Thomas called out, still wearing that shit-eating grin. "Been a while." "Not long enough. State your business and get off my land." "Now that's not very friendly," Thomas gestured to the man beside him. "This here's Marshal Cobb. He's got some questions for you." Cobb urged his horse forward a few steps. "Mr. Vance, I've received reports that you're harboring a woman against her will. That true?" "No." "That's not what Mr. Mercer says." "Mr. Mercer's a liar." Vance's voice was flat, factual. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious truth." Cobb's eyes shifted to Clara. "Miss, I need you to answer me honestly. Are you here of your own free will?" Clara stepped forward, ignoring Vance's muttered curse. "I am. Thomas Mercer lured me here under false pretenses, humiliated me publicly, and left me with nothing. Mr. Vance offered me work and shelter. I stayed because I chose to." "She's lying," Dutch spoke up. Vance has been keeping her isolated, won't let her come to town alone. That's horseshit, and you know it. Clara's anger flared hot and sudden. I come to town twice a week. Ask Ruth Calloway. Ask Ann Cordell. Ask anyone who isn't one of Thomas's lapdogs. Dutch's face went red. You watch your mouth, girl. Or what? You'll grab my arm again? Threaten me in the street? Clara took another step forward, and she felt Vance tense beside her. You already tried that. It didn't work. Enough. Cobb's voice cut through the rising tension. Miss, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you want to leave with us? I can arrange safe passage back east if you feel threatened. Clara met his eyes and saw nothing there but cold calculation. This wasn't about her safety. This was about Thomas getting what he wanted. Her humiliation, Vance's downfall, entertainment for bored men with nothing better to do. No, she said clearly. I'm staying exactly where I am. Cobb studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. Your choice. He turned to Vance. There's also been reports of cattle theft in the area. You know anything about that? No. Funny thing, 3 of the ranchers who reported losses say they saw a man matching your description near their property around the time the cattle went missing. Which ranchers? Cobb consulted a piece of paper. Hoskins, Cordell, and a widow named Patterson. Vance's jaw tightened. That's a lie. James Cordell was at the meeting where we agreed to watch each other's backs, and I helped widow Patterson mend her fence last month. Ask her yourself. Already did. She says she doesn't recall you being there. The pieces clicked into place in Clara's mind. They'd gotten to the widow, threatened her, or paid her, or both. This wasn't an investigation. It was a setup. This is ridiculous, Clara said. You can't possibly believe... What I believe doesn't matter, miss. I've got signed statements. Cobb folded the paper and tucked it inside his coat. Mr. Vance, I'm going to need you to come into town, answer some questions. I'm not going anywhere with you. That wasn't a request. Vance raised his rifle slightly. And that wasn't an answer. You want me? You're going to have to drag me. But I promise it won't be easy. The tension ratcheted up another notch. The hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons. Thomas's grin widened. Dutch looked hungry, eager. Cobb's expression didn't change. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, you're making this exactly what Thomas paid you to make it. Vance's voice was steady, but Clara could see the white-knuckle grip on his rifle. Now get off my land before someone gets hurt. For a long moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Clara's hand ached from gripping the Colt too hard, her heart hammering so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Then Cobb smiled, a thin, bloodless thing. Have it your way. He turned his horse. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. The riders backed up slowly, maintaining the semicircle, not turning their backs until they were well clear of rifle range. Thomas was the last to leave, his eyes locked on Clara. See you real soon, sweetheart, he called. Real soon. They disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving Clara and Vance standing in the yard, like survivors of a storm that hadn't quite passed. Clara's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch steps, the Colt hanging loose in her hand. Her whole body was shaking, adrenaline draining away and leaving nothing but exhaustion. Vance sat beside her. You all right? No, yes, I don't know. She looked at him. That marshal, he's working with them. Yeah. Can he do that? Just make up charges? Out here? He can do whatever he wants as long as no one stops him. Vance set his rifle down. We need to get word to Cal Winters. He's honest, at least. Will it matter? Probably not, but it's worth trying. He rubbed his face with both hands. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I know. They sat in silence for a while, watching the dust settle. Dog had stopped barking and now sat at Clara's feet, his head resting on her knee. She scratched behind his ears absently. I'm sorry, she said finally. For what? For bringing this down on you. If I hadn't come here, don't. Vance's voice was sharp. Don't apologize for existing. Thomas Mercer would have found another reason to start trouble. That's what men like him do. But, Clara, he turned to face her fully. You didn't bring this on me. He did. And I'll be damned if I let him get away with it. The fierceness in his voice surprised her. So did the protectiveness. Vance had been kind to her, yes, but always from a distance, always careful not to overstep. This felt different, personal. Before she could respond, Dog's head came up again. But this time his tail wagged, a single rider approaching from the west. Clara recognized Anne Cordell before the woman was even close enough to dismount. "Saw the dust cloud," Anne said breathlessly. "What happened?" Vance filled her in while Clara sat on the steps, too wrung out to move. Anne's expression grew darker with each detail. "Cobb's corrupt as they come," she said when he finished. "He was run out of Wyoming for taking bribes. How the hell did he end up with a badge here?" "Money talks," Vance said flatly. "James needs to know about this. The whole group does." Anne looked at Clara. "You holding up?" "I've been better." "I bet." Anne crouched beside her. "Listen to me. What you did out there, standing up to them, not backing down, that took real courage. Or real stupidity. Sometimes they're the same thing." Anne squeezed her shoulder. "But you showed them you're not someone to be pushed around. That matters." After Anne left to spread the word, Clara and Vance went about the rest of the day's work in a daze. Chores still needed doing, animals fed, water hauled, meals cooked. The mundane tasks felt surreal after the confrontation, like trying to sweep the floor during an earthquake. That night, neither of them bothered with the watch schedule. They both knew sleep wasn't coming. Instead, they sat at the table with coffee going cold between them, listening to every sound, every creak of settling wood. "Tell me about her," Clara said suddenly. "Your wife." Vance was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Sarah was from back east, Boston. Came out here with her family when she was 16. His voice was soft, distant. "Her father was a doctor, thought he could make a fortune on the frontier. He was wrong. Got himself killed trying to help during a cholera outbreak when Sarah was 18. "How did you meet?" "She needed someone to run the claim her father had filed. I don't know, something to care about besides surviving." He stared into his coffee. "We married 3 months later. People said we were rushing, that we barely knew each other. They were probably right. But you loved her." "Yeah, I did." He looked up, and Clara saw the old grief there, worn smooth, but never gone. "She got pregnant right away. We were both terrified and excited. Built a crib, picked out names, thought we had everything figured out." He didn't need to finish. Clara knew how the story ended. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago. Doesn't make it hurt less." "No." He met her eyes. "It doesn't." Something shifted in that moment, a wall coming down, a distance closing. Clara realized with a start that she cared about this man. Not the way she'd thought she cared about Thomas Mercer, with his pretty words and false promises. This was different. Built on hard work and shared danger, and the simple fact that he'd seen her at her worst and hadn't turned away. The realization terrified her. The next morning brought James Cordell and 5 other ranchers, all armed, all grim-faced. They gathered in Vance's yard like soldiers preparing for battle. "Widow Patterson recanted her statement," James said without preamble. "Turns out Dutch Morrison threatened to burn her house down if she didn't cooperate. She's willing to testify to that now." "Will it matter?" Vance asked. "To Cal Winters, yeah. To Marshal Cobb?" James shrugged. "Probably not. But it gives us leverage, proof that they're fabricating charges." Another rancher, a man named Sullivan with a thick beard and scarred hands, spoke up. "We rode past Mercer's place this morning. He's got at least 10 men there now, all armed, all strangers." "Hired guns," Vance said. "Looks like it. Question is what they're planning to do with them." "Nothing good," Clara said from the porch. The men turned to look at her, some with surprise, like they'd forgotten she was there. "Thomas Mercer doesn't do anything unless it serves him. He's not hiring guns for protection. He's hiring them to attack." "Attack what?" Sullivan asked. "Us, this ranch, maybe others." Clara descended the steps. "He wants to make an example, show everyone what happens when you cross him." James nodded slowly. "She's right. This has been building for weeks. He's not going to back down now." "So what do we do?" another rancher asked. "Wait for them to strike first?" "We prepare," Vance said. "Fortify what we can, set up signals like we discussed. And we make it clear that if they come for one of us, they come for all of us." "That might not be enough," Sullivan warned. 10 guns against what, 15 of us? And that's if everyone shows up. Then we make it enough. Vance's jaw was set. I'm not running. I'm not abandoning my land because some coward with daddy issues decided to play big man. There was a murmur of agreement, but Clara could see the fear underneath the bravado. These were ranchers, farmers, family men, not gunfighters. The violence they were preparing for wasn't theoretical anymore. It was coming, as inevitable as winter. The meeting broke up with plans for a watch rotation and an agreement to check in daily. As the men rode out, James pulled Clara aside. Anne wants you to come stay with us, just until this blows over. I'm not leaving. I figured you'd say that, he sighed. Just know the offer stands. And Clara, keep that gun close. After he left, Clara found Vance in the barn checking their ammunition supply. It was pitifully small. Enough for a skirmish, maybe, but not a sustained fight. We need more bullets, she said. We need a lot of things. Money to buy them would be a start. Clara thought about the small amount she'd saved from working at the boarding house. It wouldn't be enough, but it was something. I have a little, no. Elias, I said no. He set down the box of cartridges. I'm not taking your money for this. It's not about pride. It's about survival. It's about both. He looked at her and his expression was complicated. Gratitude mixed with frustration, mixed with something she couldn't quite name. You've given up enough. I'm not taking more. What if I want to give it? Then I'm telling you no anyway. They stared at each other, stubborn meeting stubborn. Finally, Clara threw up her hands. You are the most impossible man I've ever met. I've been told that before. Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. By your wife? Constantly. The moment of levity faded fast. They went back to counting bullets, taking inventory of supplies that would never be enough. Clara tried not to think about what would happen when the shooting started, tried not to imagine Vance bleeding out in the dirt while she stood useless and terrified. But the thoughts came anyway. That night, Clara woke to find the bed empty beside her. Vance had insisted she take the bed while he slept on the floor, and she'd been too tired to argue. She got up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and found him outside. He was sitting on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, staring at the stars. Dog lay beside him, a dark shadow against darker wood. Couldn't sleep? Clara asked. Never can before a fight. You think it's coming soon? Tomorrow. Maybe the day after. He glanced at her. You should get some rest while you can. Instead, she sat beside him. The night was cold, the kind of cold that bit through fabric and settled in your bones. But she didn't go back inside. I'm scared, she admitted. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. You're not scared? Terrified. He said it matter-of-factly, like commenting on the weather. But being scared doesn't change what needs to be done. Clara pulled the blanket tighter. What if we don't make it? What if there are too many and Then we go down fighting. Vance's voice was quiet but certain. Better that than living on our knees. She wanted to argue, to find some other way, some path that didn't end in blood and gunfire. But she knew there wasn't one. Thomas Mercer had made sure of that. I wish I'd never written back to those letters, she said. I wish I'd stayed in Philadelphia, kept scrubbing floors, kept being invisible. No, you don't. How do you know? Because you're not built for invisible. He looked at her fully, and in the starlight his face was all hard angles and shadows. You're built for this. For standing when other people run. You just didn't know it yet. The words wrapped around her like armor. Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. This was who she'd become. This was the price of refusing to break. She could live with that. They sat in silence until the eastern sky started to lighten, neither speaking, both understanding that words couldn't change what was coming. When the sun finally broke the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and red, Clara stood and went inside to make coffee. The day passed in tense normalcy. Chores got done. Animals were fed. Clara made bread, working the dough with more force than necessary, trying to channel her anxiety into something productive. Vance cleaned guns, checked fences, did all the small tasks that kept a ranch running. But they were both waiting, listening. The attack came at dusk, when the light was failing and shadows grew long. Clara was bringing in firewood when she heard it, hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast from the east. Elias! He was already moving, rifle in hand. Get inside, bar the door. No, we do this together. There was no time to argue. The riders crested the rise, 10 of them, maybe more, silhouetted against the dying light. Thomas Mercer rode at the front, Dutch Morrison beside him. The others were strangers, hired guns with dead eyes and ready weapons. They stopped at the property line just like before, but this time there was no pretense of civility, no fake marshal to provide cover. This was what it had always been, naked aggression, violence waiting to be unleashed. Thomas's voice carried across the distance. Last chance, Vance. Send the girl out, and we'll call it even. Go to hell. Have it your way. Thomas raised his hand. What happened next seemed to unfold in terrible slow motion. Thomas's hand dropped, and the riders spurred their horses forward. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes bright in the dimming light. Vance fired first, his shot taking one of the riders out of the saddle. Clara raised her Colt, her hand shaking, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her over, and she had no idea if she hit anything. The riders scattered, seeking cover behind the barn, the well, anything that would shield them from return fire. Bullets slammed into the porch, into the walls of the house, kicking up dirt and splinters. Clara and Vance retreated to the doorway, using it for cover. Vance was methodical, taking careful shots, making each bullet count. Clara fired wildly, terror and adrenaline making her clumsy. Breathe, Vance said beside her. Aim, don't just shoot. She tried, forced herself to take a breath, to line up a shot, squeezed the trigger. This time she saw one of the men jerk back, clutching his shoulder. She'd hit someone. The realization made her stomach heave, but there was no time to process it. The gunfire was constant now, a roar that filled the world. Then something changed. New gunfire erupted from the west, different rhythm, different sound. Clara risked a glance and saw riders pouring over the western ridge. James Cordell, Anne beside him, rifle in hand, Sullivan and the other ranchers, more than Clara had expected. The hired guns saw them too. Suddenly outnumbered, they started to fall back. One of them went down, then another. Dutch Morrison took a bullet in the leg and went sprawling. Thomas Mercer sat his horse in the middle of it all, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. His grand plan was falling apart, his hired guns running, his dominance crumbling. "You bitch!" he screamed at Clara. This is your fault. All of it." He raised his gun, aiming directly at her. Clara saw it happen in crystalline clarity. The gun coming up. Thomas's finger tightening on the trigger. The barrel black and enormous and pointed at her chest. She didn't think, just raised her Colt and fired. The shot took Thomas in the shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. He dropped his gun, clutching at the wound, his face gone white with shock. The fight drained out of the remaining men. They broke and ran, hauling Dutch onto a horse, leaving their wounded, their dead. Thomas went with them, still clutching his bleeding shoulder, his eyes locked on Clara with pure hatred. Then they were gone, disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving only silence and gun smoke. Clara stood in the doorway, the Colt still raised, her whole body trembling. She'd shot someone. Actually shot them. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. Vance touched her arm gently. "Clara, it's over. You can put the gun down." She lowered it slowly, her fingers cramped from gripping too hard. Around them, the ranchers were dismounting, checking for wounded, securing the perimeter. Anne appeared at Clara's side, her face smudged with powder burns. "You all right?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "You did good," Anne said firmly. "You stood your ground." Had she? Clara wasn't sure. She felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything important from her chest and left only echoes. James Cordell counted the cost. 2 of the hired guns dead, 3 wounded and captured. On their side, Sullivan had taken a bullet in the arm, and one of the younger ranchers had a gash across his ribs from a near miss. But they'd survived. They'd won. Vance found Clara sitting on the porch steps an hour later, staring at nothing. The others were still there, posting guards, tending wounds, talking in low voices about what came next. "You need to eat something," he said. "I'm not hungry. Doesn't matter, you need to eat anyway." He sat beside her. "What you did today?" "I shot him. I shot Thomas. You defended yourself. There's a difference." "Is there?" Clara looked at him, her eyes burning. I wanted to kill him. In that moment, I wanted him dead. But you didn't. You aimed for his shoulder, not his heart. Vance's voice was gentle. That counts for something. Clara wasn't sure she believed him, but she was too tired to argue. Cal Winters showed up near midnight, brought by one of the ranchers who'd ridden to fetch him. He took statements, examined the bodies, listened to the whole ugly story. When he heard about Marshal Cobb's involvement, his jaw went tight. I'll handle Cobb, he said grimly, and I'll put out a warrant for Thomas Mercer and Dutch Morrison. Assault, attempted murder, conspiracy. They're done in this territory. They'll just go somewhere else, Clara said dully. Start over. Maybe, but they won't be doing it here. Winters looked at her with something like respect. You've got guts, Miss Whitlock. Not many people would have stood like you did. After he left, after the other ranchers finally headed home with promises to return if needed, after the bodies were loaded onto a wagon and the wounded were tended, Clara and Vance were finally alone. The house was a mess, bullet holes in the walls, broken windows, the door frame splintered, but it was still standing, like them. Clara sat at the table, her head in her hands, while Vance made coffee by lamplight. When he set a cup in front of her, she wrapped both hands around it, seeking warmth. What happens now? She asked. We rebuild, fix what's broken, keep going. Just like that? Just like that. He sat across from her. Thomas and Dutch are gone. The others won't come back without them. It's over, Clara. She wanted to believe him, but some part of her would always be waiting for the next attack, the next humiliation, the next moment when everything fell apart. Vance seemed to read her thoughts. It gets easier. The fear. Not gone, but easier to carry. How do you know? Because I'm still carrying mine, but I'm still here. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. We're both still here. Clara looked at their hands, his scarred and calloused, hers stained with powder burns. Two people who'd been broken by the world and somehow found each other in the wreckage. Thank you, she said quietly, for not giving up on me, for standing with me. Clara, his grip tightened. You saved yourself. I just had the good sense not to get in your way. She laughed, a broken sound that might have been a sob. Then she was crying, really crying, all the fear and rage and relief pouring out in great heaving gasps. Vance came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she shook apart. When the storm finally passed, Clara pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve. Sorry, she muttered. Don't be. Vance brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. You're allowed to break sometimes. Doesn't make you weak. Clara looked up at him, at this quiet man who'd given her shelter and taught her to shoot and stood beside her when the world came down. And she realized something that should have terrified her but didn't. She was falling in love with him. The thought settled over her like snow, soft, inevitable, transforming everything it touched. But she didn't say it. Not yet. There would be time for that later. For now, they had a ranch to rebuild and a future to figure out. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Clara believed they actually had one. The days after the shooting blurred together in a haze of repairs and visitors. Word had spread fast. The woman who'd stood down Thomas Mercer, the rancher who'd defended his land, the community that had banded together against hired guns. People Clara had never met stopped by with food, lumber, offers of help. Some came out of genuine kindness. Others just wanted to see the bullet holes, to hear the story firsthand, to touch the edges of violence and walk away unscathed. Clara hated it. The attention made her skin crawl, made her feel like some kind of curiosity in a traveling show. But she smiled and thanked them and accepted their casseroles because refusing would have been worse. Vance handled it better, or at least pretended to. He'd nod, shake hands, answer questions with as few words as possible. But Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked every stranger who rode up the drive. The fear hadn't left either of them. It had just changed shape. A week after the attack, Clara was replacing broken window glass when Anne Cordell arrived with Lily strapped to her back in a sling. Brought supplies, Anne announced, hauling a basket from her wagon. And news, if you want it. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Good news or bad? Depends on your perspective. Anne set the basket down. Thomas Mercer and Dutch Morrison crossed into Wyoming territory 3 days ago. Cal Winters sent word to the marshals there, but who knows if they'll actually do anything about it. So they're just gone? Free? For now. Anne's expression hardened. But they're wounded, broke, and wanted. That's something. Clara supposed it was, but it didn't feel like justice. It felt like unfinished business, like a wound that hadn't quite healed. How are you holding up? Anne asked, her voice gentler. I'm fine. Clara? I am. I'm just... Clara set down the putty knife. I keep seeing it. His face when I shot him, the way he looked at me. Like you'd beaten him. Like he wanted to kill me. Probably did. Anne shifted Lily to her other hip. But he didn't. You're still here, and he's running scared. That's worth something. Was it? Clara wasn't sure anymore. The victory felt hollow, paid for in sleepless nights, and the constant weight of the Colt on her hip. She'd proven she could fight, could survive. But at what cost? Anne seemed to read her thoughts. You know what I think? I think you're trying to decide if you're a good person who did a bad thing or a bad person who did what was necessary. Clara's throat tightened. Which one am I? Neither. You're just a person who survived. Anne squeezed her shoulder. Stop trying to make it more complicated than that. After Anne left, Clara went back to the window repair with a clearer head. The work was meditative, scraping out old putty, fitting new glass, sealing it in place. Simple, fixable. Unlike the complicated mess inside her chest. She was finishing the last pane when Vance came in from the barn, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. Water pump's fixed, he said. Should hold through winter now. Good. Clara climbed down from the chair. Anne came by. Thomas and Dutch are in Wyoming. Vance absorbed this with a single nod. Figured they'd run. Does it bother you that they got away? Bothers me they existed in the first place, but them being gone? He shrugged. I'll take it. Clara envied his ability to let go, to accept an imperfect resolution and move forward. She was still holding on to everything. Anger, fear, the bone-deep certainty that the other shoe would eventually drop. I don't know how to stop waiting for the next bad thing, she admitted. Vance was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat, gesturing for her to do the same. After Sarah died, he said slowly, I spent 2 years expecting the world to finish the job. Waited for the ranch to fail, for another tragedy, for whatever punishment I'd clearly earned. He looked at his hands. One day I realized I'd been so busy waiting to die that I'd forgotten to live. What changed? Nothing dramatic. I just woke up one morning and decided I was tired. Tired of being scared, tired of waiting, tired of giving the world that kind of power over me. He met her eyes. You can't control what happens, Clara. But you can control whether you spend your life braced for impact or actually living it. That's easier said than done. Everything is, a ghost of a smile. But you're tougher than you think. You've already proven that. Clara wanted to argue, to list all the ways she was still broken, still scared. But looking at Vance, at this man who'd lost everything and somehow kept going, she felt something shift. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the possibility of it. I'll try, she said finally. That's all anyone can do. The conversation stayed with Clara over the following weeks as autumn deepened into something harder. The aspens lost their gold, leaving skeletal branches against gray skies. The first snow came early, dusting the prairie in white that melted by noon. Clara and Vance worked side by side, preparing for winter, smoking meat, stacking firewood, reinforcing the barn against the cold that was coming. The work was constant and exhausting, but Clara found comfort in it. Sore muscles and calloused hands were proof she was alive, present, doing something useful. The nightmares still came, Thomas's face, the sound of gunfire, the weight of the Colt in her hand, but they came less frequently. She was healing, she realized. Slowly, imperfectly, but healing nonetheless. One evening in late October, Clara was making stew when Vance came in carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. What's that? She asked. He set it on the table and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a dress, simple but well made, dark blue wool with pearl buttons. Clara stared at it. Where did you... Ruth Calloway made it. Well, you made most of it. She just finished what you started. He looked almost embarrassed. You've been wearing the same 3 dresses since you got here. Figured you could use something new. Clara ran her fingers over the fabric. She vaguely remembered working on this months ago, during those first weeks at the boarding house. She'd forgotten about it, assumed Ruth had sold it or given it away. I can't afford, already paid for, consider it back wages for all the work you've done around here. Elias, just try it on. If it doesn't fit, Ruth said she'll adjust it. Clara took the dress into the bedroom, her hands shaking slightly. When was the last time someone had given her something that wasn't charity or pity? Something that said they saw her as a person, not a problem to be solved? The dress fit perfectly. Clara stood in front of the small mirror, barely recognizing herself. Not because of the dress, though it was lovely, but because of the woman wearing it. Sun-darkened skin, strong shoulders, eyes that had seen too much but hadn't gone dead. This wasn't the naive girl who'd stepped off the train. This was someone harder, someone who'd survived, someone she might actually be proud of. When she came out, Vance looked up from the stove and went very still. It fits, Clara said unnecessarily. Yeah. His voice was rough. It does. They stood there for a moment, something unspoken hanging between them. Then Dog barked at nothing, breaking the spell, and they both laughed. Stew's burning, Clara said. Let it. But Vance moved to stir it anyway. They ate dinner in comfortable silence, the kind that came from months of living in each other's pockets. Clara caught herself watching him, the way he moved, economical and sure. The lines around his eyes that deepened when he almost smiled, the silver threading through his dark hair. When had she started seeing him as something more than just the man who'd saved her? The answer was complicated. Maybe it had been gradual, built from small kindnesses and shared work. Or maybe it had happened all at once during the gunfight, when she'd realized she'd rather die beside him than live without him. Either way, the feeling was there now. Undeniable. Terrifying. Later, after the dishes were washed and the fire banked, Clara found Vance on the porch despite the cold. He'd taken to sitting out here most evenings, rifle across his knees, watching the dark. Still expecting trouble? She asked. Old habits. He moved over, making room. Clara sat, pulling her shawl tight. The stars were brilliant tonight, sharp and cold against the black sky. Can I ask you something? She said. You're going to anyway. Fair point. Why did you take me in, that first day? You could have pointed me toward town, given me a few dollars, sent me on my way. Vance was quiet for a long time. You want the truth or the polite answer? Truth. I was lonely. He said it simply, without self-pity. This ranch, this life, it works fine for one person. But it's lonely. When I saw you on that platform, looking like the world had just ended, I saw myself 8 years ago. He paused. Figured maybe we could be lonely together, make it a little less heavy. Clara's chest tightened. And now? Now I'm not lonely anymore. He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. I'm not sure what to do with that. Me neither. They sat with that confession between them, both too scared to push it further. Clara wanted to reach for his hand, to close the distance that had kept them safe and separate, but fear held her back. Fear of ruining what they had, fear of wanting something she might not deserve. The moment passed. Vance stood, stretching. Getting cold. We should head in. Clara nodded, swallowing her disappointment. As they walked inside, his hand brushed hers, maybe accidentally, maybe not. The brief contact sent electricity up her arm. Inside, they went through the familiar routine, banking the fire, checking the locks, setting the rifle by the door. Clara changed into her nightdress behind the bedroom curtain, hyper-aware of Vance moving around the main room. When she came out, he'd already made his bed on the floor. You should take the bed, Clara said, like she did every night. I'm fine here, he replied, like he did every night. But tonight, Clara didn't accept it. Elias, it's been months. You can't keep sleeping on the floor. I've slept in worse places. That's not the point. She took a breath. We're both adults. The bed's big enough for 2 people. This is ridiculous. Vance looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. Clara, I'm not suggesting anything improper. I'm suggesting we both get a decent night's sleep instead of you waking up with back pain and me feeling guilty about it. She crossed her arms. Unless you don't trust yourself to behave like a gentleman. That got a real smile out of him. My self-control isn't the issue. Then what is? Nothing. You're right. He gathered his blanket. It's practical. They settled on opposite sides of the bed, a careful foot of space between them. Clara lay rigid, acutely aware of every breath, every shift of weight. This was a terrible idea. She'd never sleep. But exhaustion had other plans. Within minutes, she felt herself drifting, the warmth and presence of another person beside her more comforting than she'd expected. Just before sleep took her, she felt Vance's hand find hers in the darkness. She squeezed back. Neither of them said anything. Neither needed to. The next morning, Clara woke to find him already up, coffee brewing, the moment from last night sealed away under their usual careful distance. But something had changed. The air felt different, charged. Over breakfast, Vance cleared his throat. Been thinking, winter's coming. The house needs more work than I can do alone. I can help. I know, but I meant we should hire someone, maybe expand the operation, bring in some cattle, make this place actually profitable. Clara set down her coffee. You're talking about the future. I am. Why now? Because for the first time in 8 years, I can see one. He met her eyes. Because of you. The words hung there, weighted with everything they weren't quite saying. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't know if I'm ready for... She started. I'm not asking you to be. I'm just saying the option exists, if you want it. Did she? The question terrified her. Wanting something meant risking it, meant opening herself up to the possibility of loss. She'd sworn she wouldn't do that again. But looking at Vance, at this man who'd given her space to heal and taught her to be strong and never once demanded more than she could give, how could she not want that? I'll think about it, she said quietly. That's all I'm asking. The conversation shifted to safer topics. The fence that needed mending, the chickens that had stopped laying, dog's mysterious aversion to the new rooster. But Clara felt it underneath every word, the possibility of something more, waiting like a seed under snow. Cal Winters came by 2 days later with news. Thomas Mercer had been arrested in Cheyenne on outstanding warrants. Dutch Morrison was still missing, but the hired guns had scattered to the winds. It's over, Winters said. Really over this time. Clara should have felt relief. Instead, she felt strangely empty, like she'd been carrying a weight for so long she didn't know what to do without it. What happens to Thomas? She asked. Trial, probably prison, if the judge is honest. Winters looked at her seriously. You might be called to testify. The thought made her stomach turn, facing Thomas again, reliving it all in front of strangers. Do I have to? No, but it would help. I'll think about it. After Winters left, Vance found her in the garden, staring at nothing. You all right? I don't know. I should be happy he got caught, right? That's justice. Should doesn't matter. How do you actually feel? Clara considered this. Tired. Like I've been running a race and someone just told me I can stop, but I don't remember how. That'll come back. Give it time. How much time? However much you need. He touched her shoulder lightly. No rush. But there was a rush, Clara realized. Not from him, but from inside herself. She was tired of being broken. Tired of letting Thomas Mercer take up space in her head. Tired of being afraid to want things. That night, she lay awake long after Vance's breathing had evened out beside her. The bed thing had become routine now, both of them staying carefully on their sides, never touching except for those few seconds when sleep loosened their control. Clara turned her head to look at him in the darkness. His face was softer in sleep, younger. She thought about reaching out, closing that distance, taking the risk. Instead, she closed her eyes and tried to sleep. November brought the first real snowfall, 6 inches that blanketed everything in white silence. Clara woke to find Vance already outside, clearing paths to the barn and well. She dressed quickly and joined him, grabbing the spare shovel. They worked side by side, breath steaming in the cold air. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. When they finished, they stood in the yard, surveying their work. Pretty, Clara said, looking at the untouched snow stretching to the horizon. Cold, Vance countered. That too. She turned to him. I've been thinking about what you said, about the future. He went still. Yeah, I want to testify. Against Thomas. The decision had crystallized overnight. sharp and certain. Not because I have to, because I want to. I want to stand in front of a judge and tell the truth about what he did. That's going to be hard. I know, but I'm tired of him having power over me, even from a jail cell. She met his eyes. And after that, when it's really over, I want to talk about the other thing. The future thing. Yeah, that. Vance's expression did something complicated. Okay. Okay. I'll wait. He smiled, a real one this time. Not going anywhere. The trial was set for January in the territorial capital. Cal Winters arranged for Clara and Vance to travel there safely, along with several other witnesses. The journey took 3 days through snow and cold, staying in rough roadhouses where the food was terrible and the beds worse. Clara spent the time rehearsing her testimony in her head, trying to find the words for what had happened. But how did you explain being destroyed and rebuilt? How did you make a stranger understand? The courthouse was an imposing stone building that made Clara feel small. Inside, it smelled like old paper and anxiety. Thomas was already there, flanked by a lawyer who looked expensive. When he saw Clara, his face twisted with rage. "You!" he spat. "This is your fault!" "No," Clara said clearly. "This is yours." The trial lasted 2 days. Clara testified on the second day, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger as she spoke. She told the truth, all of it. The letters, the humiliation, the bet. The way he'd tried to destroy her just for existing. Thomas's lawyer tried to paint her as an opportunist, a gold digger who'd come west looking for easy money. But Clara didn't rise to the bait. She just kept telling the truth. When it was over, the jury deliberated for less than an hour. Guilty on all counts. Clara sat in the gallery and watched Thomas Mercer's face as the verdict was read. She waited to feel triumph, vindication, something. Instead, she just felt tired. Outside the courthouse, snow was falling again. Vance was waiting on the steps. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I can finally breathe." Clara tilted her face up to the snow. "Like maybe I can let it go now." "Can you?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know, but I want to try." They left the capital the next morning, traveling slower this time, stopping when they were tired instead of pushing through. On the second night, they stayed at a small inn with actual beds and hot food. After dinner, Clara found Vance standing by the window of their room, looking out at the snow-covered prairie. "You've been quiet," she said. "Been thinking." "About?" "About what happens when we get home." He turned to face her. "About whether you're going to stay." Clara's heart kicked. "Why wouldn't I?" "Because you don't owe me anything. You never did. The trial's over. Thomas is in prison. You're free to go wherever you want. And if I want to stay, then I need to know why." His voice was rough. "Because I can't, Clara, I can't keep pretending this is just practical, that you're just someone who works for me." "What am I then?" "Everything." The word came out raw. "You're everything. And if you're staying out of obligation or pity or because you think you don't have other options, I need you to leave. Because I can't do this halfway." Clara crossed the room, closing the distance between them. "I'm not staying out of obligation." "Then why?" "Because somewhere between the train platform and the trial, I fell in love with you." She said it simply, without ceremony. "I fought it, told myself it was gratitude or fear or proximity, but it's not. It's love." Vance stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't understand. "Clara, I know it's complicated. I know I'm still figuring out who I am, and you're still carrying your grief, and we're both damaged in ways that don't just heal." She took his hand. "But I want to try. If you do." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with a fierceness that stole her breath. "I'm terrified," he said against her hair. "Me too. I don't know how to do this, how to love someone without losing them. Neither do I, but we'll figure it out together." He pulled back just enough to see her face, his eyes searching hers. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." Vance kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper, years of loneliness and want pouring into the contact. Clara kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, anchoring herself to this moment, this man, this choice. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Vance rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. Clara laughed, the sound somewhere between joy and disbelief. "That's not a question." "It is if you want it to be." "Marry me, Clara. Not because you need protection or because it's practical, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you." She thought about saying yes immediately, but she owed them both honesty. "Ask me again when we get home," she said, "when we're back in the real world, not caught up in the aftermath of everything. If you still want to, then ask me again." "And you'll say yes?" "Probably," she smiled. "But make it a good proposal. I've earned that much." They traveled home slowly, savoring the journey instead of rushing through it. When the ranch finally came into view, snow-covered and solid against the winter sky, Clara felt something settle in her chest. Home. Not because it was where she'd ended up, but because it was where she'd chosen to be. That night, after the animals were fed and the fire was lit and they had fallen into bed exhausted, Vance turned to her in the darkness. "Clara Whitlock," he said, "will you marry me?" She laughed. "That's the same proposal as before." "You said make it good. Didn't say how good." "Fair point." She turned to face him fully. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her, slow and sweet, sealing the promise. Outside, the wind howled and snow fell and the world kept turning. But inside, two people who'd been broken by different cruelties chose to heal together. And that was enough. They married in February, on a day so cold the preacher's breath froze in the air between his words. The ceremony was simple, held in Ruth Calloway's boarding house parlor with Anne and James Cordell as witnesses, dog lying by the door like he was standing guard. Clara wore the blue wool dress, and Vance had borrowed a clean shirt from James that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. There were no flowers, no music, no grand gestures. Just two people promising to try, which was all either of them had to give. When the preacher pronounced them married, Vance kissed her carefully, like she might break. Clara kissed him back harder, reminding him she wouldn't. The small gathering afterward was loud and warm. Ruth had made a cake, Anne brought whiskey, and the handful of ranchers who'd shown up told stories that grew more exaggerated with each retelling. Someone mentioned the shootout, and Clara felt herself tense, but Vance's hand found hers under the table and squeezed. "You don't have to stay," he murmured. "I know, but I want to." She looked around the room, at these people who'd stood with them, fought beside them, chosen to see her as something other than a cautionary tale. They're family now, I guess. Guess so. It was strange, that word. Family. Clara had spent so much of her life alone, first in Philadelphia after her parents died, then in the aftermath of Thomas's betrayal. The idea that she belonged somewhere, to someone, felt foreign, like wearing shoes that hadn't been broken in yet. But she'd learn. They both would. The party broke up as darkness fell, people heading home before the temperature dropped further. Anne hugged Clara tightly before leaving. "You did it," Anne whispered. "You survived." "We both did." "Yeah, but you had it harder." Anne pulled back, her eyes bright. "I'm proud of you, Clara Vance." Clara Vance. The name sat oddly in her mouth, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Like everything else in her life now, new, uncertain, but hers by choice. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Vance helped her down from the wagon with a formality that would have been funny if it weren't so earnest. "You nervous?" Clara asked. "Terrified." "Me too." They stood in the cold yard, married but not quite sure what came next. Finally Vance laughed, a real sound, unguarded. "This is ridiculous. We've been sleeping in the same bed for months." "That was different." "How?" "It just was." Clara took his hand. "But I suppose we should go inside before we freeze to death on our wedding night." Inside, the house felt different. Or maybe Clara just felt different. She moved around the familiar space, stoking the fire, putting coffee on, while Vance watched from the doorway. "You can help, you know," she said. "I know, I'm just—" He trailed off. "What?" "Trying to remember what this feels like, being happy." He said it simply, like admitting to a forgotten language. "It's been a long time." Clara crossed to him, standing close enough to feel his warmth. "We're allowed to be happy, even after everything. Maybe especially after everything." "You really believe that?" "I'm trying to." She touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. Ask me tomorrow, and the day after. Eventually, I might convince myself. He caught her hand, pressed his lips to her palm. I love you. I know, she smiled. I love you too. Even though you're terrible at proposals and you name your dog Dog. He likes it. He's a dog. He'd respond to Potato if you said it right. They fell into bed still laughing, the nervousness dissolving into something easier. What happened next was tender and awkward and real. Two people learning each other, making mistakes, trying again. Not the passionate fantasy from penny novels, but something better, something honest. Afterward, Clara lay with her head on Vance's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. You all right? He asked. Better than all right. She traced patterns on his skin. I was just thinking a year ago I was in Philadelphia scrubbing floors and reading Thomas's letters, imagining this completely different life. If someone had told me then where I'd actually end up, you wouldn't have believed them. I would have run screaming. She laughed quietly. But this, what we have, it's better than anything I imagined, because it's real. Even the hard parts, especially those, the hard parts taught me I was stronger than I thought. She propped herself up to look at him. You taught me that. You taught yourself. I just didn't get in the way. Clara kissed him, slow and deep, then settled back against his chest. Outside, the wind howled around the house, but inside they were warm, safe, together. She'd never take that for granted. Winter deepened, and with it came the hard work of survival. Clara and Vance fell into new rhythms, working side by side during the day, planning improvements for when the thaw came, talking late into the night about the future they were building. It wasn't always easy. They fought sometimes, about money, about priorities, about whose turn it was to deal with the chickens. Clara's temper would flare, Vance would shut down, and they'd spend hours in tense silence before one of them broke, usually Clara. I hate this, she said one evening after a particularly stupid argument about fence posts. I hate that we can't just be happy. We are happy. Vance looked up from the harness he was mending. Happy doesn't mean never fighting. Then what does it mean? It means fighting and still choosing to stay. He set down his work. It means trusting that tomorrow we'll figure out how to do better. Clara absorbed this. Is that what you and Sarah had? It was the first time she'd asked directly about his first marriage. Vance was quiet for a long moment. No, Sarah and I, we were young and desperate, and we clung to each other because the alternative was drowning. He met her eyes. What we have is different, stronger, because we're not running from something. We're running toward it. Toward what? Whatever comes next. He held out his hand. Together. Clara took it, letting him pull her close. The anger drained away, leaving only the truth. They were both still learning how to love without fear, how to trust without waiting for betrayal. It would take time, but they had that now. Spring came late that year, snow lingering into April before finally surrendering to mud and green shoots. Clara threw herself into the garden with a ferocity that surprised even her, planting twice as much as the year before. Vance hired a hand, a young man named Ben who'd lost his family to fever and needed work, and together they started building a proper barn. The ranch was growing, changing. So was Clara. She was stronger now, her body hard with muscle, her hands permanently stained and scarred. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Sun-darkened skin, new lines around her eyes, a hardness in her expression that hadn't been there before. But there was something else too, a certainty, a groundedness. She knew who she was now, what she was capable of, and she liked that person. One afternoon in May, Anne Cordell arrived with news and a basket of eggs. You're pregnant, she announced before Clara could even say hello. Clara froze. What? Don't give me that look. I've seen it enough times to recognize the signs. Anne grinned. How far along? I don't know if... Clara's mind raced, calculating. Her last monthly had been... When? She'd been so busy she hadn't paid attention. Oh, you're pregnant, all right. Anne set down the basket. How do you feel about it? Terrified, Clara almost said. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt almost like joy. I don't know yet, she admitted. That's fair. It's a big thing. Anne squeezed her hand. But you'll be a good mother. You've got the spine for it. After Anne left, Clara sat on the porch steps, one hand pressed to her stomach. A baby. She and Vance hadn't talked about children, hadn't planned for it, but then they'd never planned for any of this. She found him in the new barn, helping Ben frame out the stalls. "Can we talk?" she asked. Something in her voice made him set down the hammer immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Maybe. I don't know." She took a breath. "Anne thinks I'm pregnant." Vance went very still. "Are you?" "Probably. I haven't been to a doctor, but the signs are there." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Clara's stomach twisted. What if he didn't want this? What if it was too much, too soon, too reminiscent of what he'd lost? Then he crossed to her, pulling her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "We're having a baby," he said against her hair, and his voice was shaking. "You're not upset?" "Upset? Clara, I'm terrified, but I'm also—" He pulled back to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. "I never thought I'd get this chance again. To be a father. To have a family." Clara's own tears started then, relief and fear and hope all tangled together. "I don't know if I can do this." "Neither do I, but we'll figure it out." He pressed his hand to her stomach, his palm warm through the fabric, just like everything else. The pregnancy was hard. Clara spent the first few months sick, barely able to keep food down. The garden suffered, the house fell into disarray, and she felt useless and angry at her own body's betrayal. Vance picked up the slack without complaint, taking over the cooking and cleaning while still managing the ranch work. Anne visited regularly, bringing remedies and advice and the kind of practical sympathy that made Clara cry. "This is normal," Anne assured her during a particularly bad week. "Your body's doing something incredible. Give it time." "I hate being weak." "You're not weak. You're growing a human being. That's the opposite of weak." Anne handed her a cup of ginger tea. "And even if you were weak, so what? Everyone's allowed to be weak sometimes." Clara wanted to argue, but the truth was she was too tired. So she drank the tea and let herself be taken care of, learning slowly that accepting help wasn't the same as giving up. By the second trimester, the sickness eased and Clara felt almost normal again. Her body changed in ways that fascinated and frightened her. The swell of her belly, the strange flutters of movement, the way her whole center of gravity shifted. Vance was endlessly patient, adjusting his expectations as her capabilities changed. When she couldn't lift heavy loads, he brought things to her. When she needed to rest, he made sure she did. And at night, he'd rest his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick, wonder written all over his face. "You think about names yet?" he asked one evening. "Some. Nothing feels right." "What about Sarah? If it's a girl?" Clara looked at him, surprised. "Really? She'd have liked that, knowing she wasn't forgotten." He paused. "But only if you're comfortable with it." Clara considered this. She'd never met Sarah Vance, but she knew her through the things left behind. The gun belt, the way Vance still flinched sometimes when he looked at baby clothes, the depth of grief that never quite healed. "Sarah, if it's a girl," she agreed. "And if it's a boy?" They debated this for weeks, finally settling on James, after James Cordell, who'd stood with them when it mattered. The baby came in December, 3 weeks early and in the middle of a snowstorm. Anne had moved in a week prior, sensing the birth was imminent, and thank goodness for that because the labor was long and brutal. Clara had thought she understood pain, had felt it in blistered hands and aching muscles in the aftermath of violence. But this was different. This was her body tearing itself apart to make room for something new, and there were moments she was certain she wouldn't survive it. "You're doing fine," Anne said, wiping Clara's face with a cool cloth. "I'm dying." "You're not dying. You're just having a baby." Anne's voice was calm, steady. "I know it doesn't feel like there's a difference, but there is." Vance hovered nearby, looking helpless and terrified. Clara wanted to comfort him, but couldn't spare the energy. All she could do was breathe and push and endure. When the baby finally came, slippery and screaming, Clara collapsed back against the pillows, certain she'd never move again. "It's a girl," Anne announced, wrapping the baby in clean cloth. "You've got a daughter." "A daughter, Sarah." Anne placed the baby on Clara's chest, and Clara looked down at this tiny, furious creature with wonder. She had Vance's dark hair and Clara's nose and lungs that worked just fine based on the volume of her screaming. "Hello?" Clara whispered. "Hello, little one." Vance touched the baby's head with trembling fingers. "She's perfect. She's loud. That too." He was crying, tears streaming down his face unchecked. "Thank you for this, for her, for everything." Clara wanted to say something profound, something that captured the enormity of the moment, but exhaustion dragged at her, and all she managed was, "You're welcome. Now someone take her before I drop her." Anne laughed and scooped up the baby, giving Clara space to rest. Vance stayed, holding her hand, both of them too overwhelmed for words. They'd made something together. Not just a child, but a future. A family. Something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth all the pain it took to get here. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding, and learning how to function on no rest and pure terror. Sarah was a demanding baby, wanting to be held constantly, screaming if put down for even a moment. "She's going to be trouble," Vance said one night, walking her back and forth while Clara tried to grab an hour of sleep. "Like her mother," Clara mumbled into the pillow. Exactly like her mother. Despite the exhaustion, Clara had never been happier. Watching Vance with their daughter, the careful way he held her, the songs he made up, the absolute devotion in his eyes, filled something in Clara she hadn't known was empty. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not romance or rescue, but partnership. A life built on honesty and hard work, and the choice to keep choosing each other, even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. Spring came again, and with it the first anniversary of their marriage. Clara left Sarah with Anne for the afternoon, a rare luxury, and she and Vance rode out to the valley where they'd first fought together. The bullet holes in the barn had been patched, but you could still see where they'd been. Physical reminders of what they'd survived. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," Clara said, dismounting. "Feels longer." "In a good way or bad way?" "Good way. Like we've always been this." Vance helped her down. "Like there was never a version of me that didn't have you." Clara leaned against him, comfortable in a way she'd never been with anyone else. "You know what's strange? I barely think about Thomas anymore. Or Dutch. Or any of it. That's not strange. That's healing. I used to think healing meant forgetting, but it doesn't, does it? It just means the past doesn't own you anymore." "Yeah." Vance kissed the top of her head. "That's exactly what it means." They stood there for a while, watching the sun move across the sky, feeling the warmth on their faces. The ranch spread out below them. Their home, their future, proof that something good could grow from terrible beginnings. "I'm glad I got on that train," Clara said suddenly, "even knowing how it would turn out. Especially knowing how it would turn out." She turned to face him. "Because yes, it was awful. Thomas was cruel, and I was humiliated, and I thought my life was over. But if none of that had happened, I wouldn't have met you, wouldn't have learned what I was capable of, wouldn't have Sarah. You'd have had an easier life somewhere else." "Maybe, but easier isn't always better." Clara took his hand. "I like who I became here. I like the life we built. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Vance pulled her close, and they stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd been broken by the world, and somehow found each other in the wreckage. The years that followed weren't easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, sick animals and failed crops, the constant struggle of trying to make a living from stubborn land. Sarah grew into a wild, fearless child who kept them both exhausted. 2 years later, they had a son, James, as planned, who was quieter but no less demanding. The ranch expanded slowly. They built a bigger house, hired more help, became pillars of the small community. Clara started teaching the local children to read, using the skills she'd learned in Philadelphia. Vance served on the town council, helping settle disputes and plan for the future. Thomas Mercer spent 5 years in prison and was released in 1889. Clara heard about it through Ruth Calloway, who'd heard it from a traveling merchant. "Thought you should know," Ruth said, "in case he comes back." But he never did. Word eventually reached them that he died in a bar fight in Colorado, drunk and broke and unmissed. Dutch Morrison's fate was less certain. Some said he'd gone to California, others that he'd been shot during a robbery. Clara didn't particularly care which story was true. The past was the past. It had shaped her, tested her, nearly destroyed her. But it hadn't won. On Clara's 40th birthday, the family gathered on the porch of the big house they'd built together. Sarah was 15 now, tall and stubborn, and desperate to prove herself. James was 13, quiet and thoughtful like his father. A third child, a daughter they'd named Ruth, was playing in the dirt at their feet. Vance sat beside Clara, gray threading through his hair now, lines deeper around his eyes. But he still looked at her the way he had that first night they'd kissed, like she was something precious and unexpected. "You happy?" he asked. Clara looked at her children, at the ranch spread out before them, at the life they'd carved from nothing. She thought about the girl who'd stepped off the train 17 years ago, naive and hopeful and so easily broken. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, who'd faced down violence and grief and uncertainty and survived. Who'd learned that love wasn't about pretty words or grand gestures, but about showing up every day and choosing to stay. "Yeah," Clara said, leaning into Vance's warmth. "I'm happy. Even with the hard parts? Especially with the hard parts. They taught me who I was." She took his hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that had held her up when she couldn't stand alone. "They taught me who we could be." Sarah came running up the porch steps, James trailing behind with baby Ruth on his shoulders. "Ma, James said I can't help with the new fence, but that's not fair because I'm stronger than him. And you're not stronger than me. Am too." Clara and Vance exchanged a look, the kind of look that came from years of partnership, from knowing each other's thoughts before they were spoken. "Your mother and I will discuss it," Vance said diplomatically. "After dinner." The children ran off, still arguing. Dog, an ancient creature now, more gray than black, lifted his head from the porch and sighed, clearly unimpressed with the noise. "They're going to be the death of us," Vance said. "Probably," Clara smiled. "But what a way to go." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, Clara Vance sat surrounded by the family she'd built from nothing and felt something she'd spent most of her life searching for. Not perfection, not the fantasy from Thomas's letters or the dreams she'd carried from Philadelphia, but something better, something real. A life earned through survival and stubbornness and the refusal to let cruelty have the final word. A love built not on promises but on the daily choice to honor them. A future that belonged entirely to her because she'd fought for every piece of it. The frontier had tried to break her, had thrown everything it had at her: humiliation, violence, loss, fear. But Clara Vance had learned something important in those early terrible days, something that carried her through 17 years of hard work and harder choices. She was stronger than the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and that strength, once earned, could never be taken away. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, as her children's laughter drifted from inside the house, as her husband's hand found hers in the familiar darkness, Clara thought about that moment on the train platform. The moment she'd had nothing, was nothing, believed she'd never be anything again. If she could go back and tell that broken girl one thing, it would be this: the ending you're imagining isn't the ending you'll get. It'll be harder, bloodier, earned through pain you can't yet imagine. But it'll be yours, completely, undeniably yours. And that will make all the difference.